So our passage this morning is Colossians chapter 1. If you've got a Bible, do turn to it or grab it on your phone. I think it should be on the screen. Maybe. Who knows? Colossians chapter 1, and we're reading from verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hi, St. Mary's. It is lovely to join you virtually today. I wonder what you think of when you hear the word supreme. Maybe Diana Ross and the Supremes, maybe the clothing brand, maybe some kind of science fiction supreme overlord. I would say it's a word that has fallen out of our vocabulary, not a word that we use very regularly, or even have a modern positive comparison to. When we say Jesus is supreme, that could feel relatively detached or removed, right? It's such a broad word that it's important to take the time to learn and to unpack it, which is what we're doing here with this Jesus Is series. Different words that describe Jesus and what they really mean. And so I'll be honest with you, straight out of the gate, understanding passages like this doesn't really come quite so naturally to me. My personality means that I really like the pragmatic application of Jesus's teachings, but also my artistic, creative side loved the kind of flowy imagery and poetry of the Psalms. I loved English literature at school. I loved breaking down a chapter of a book or a poem to discover the deeper meaning. I can explain to you different devices used, like pathetic fallacy in Frankenstein, which is where the weather and the character's emotions match up. I can recount the use of liminal spaces in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And yet I struggle to process passages like this from Colossians, because there is sometimes so much assumed doctrine and biblical concepts packed into these sentences and words. It's very easy to gloss over it, to skim past it, to not fully comprehend the depth to it. And yet sitting with this passage over the last few days, reading it again and again, listening to what others teach from it, I've come to see the beauty and the poetry that is wrapped up in these words. I've come to realize how thought out and deliberate Paul is when talking about Jesus. Paul's desire when writing this letter was to reinstill a sense of awe, a sense of wonder and gratitude into the Colossians. That in being reminded of the truth about Christ, this church would not be lured in by false teachings, but instead be filled to know Jesus and follow him more closely. And that's my hope for us today. That breaking down the depth and poetry within this passage will bring a deeper understanding of the bigness and the authority of God, and how a word and concept like supreme needn't be daunting or complex, but inspiring and hopeful. Just to say, I'm not going to unpack every single sentence or every single word. If you're following this series on your table, if you're reading this book at home, there are loads of great commentaries and books that we would gladly recommend to help aid that learning and understanding. But without further ado, I'm going to start. Verse 15, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Look at how Jesus navigated the world, how he interacted with people, how he spoke into situations. We don't have to wonder what God is like because he has made himself known through Jesus. He demonstrates the nature and character of God. And he says this himself in John 14, verse 9. He says, "If you have seen me, you have seen God the Father." And this is no mundane thing. I like how it's put in Hebrews. It says, the Son is the radiance of God's glory. And radiance is such a descriptive, such a visceral word. You can almost see it glowing on the page. My granddad in recent years has gotten into painting iconography. Religious iconography, if you've not heard of it before, was and is particularly present in the Orthodox Church. It's the artwork of religious figures or scenes. There's a lot of symbolism in these images, and namely the gold halo, which is used to indicate holy or sacred figures. And Jesus is always depicted as having one of these gold halos, but he is set apart by having the cross etched into the background of this halo. My granddad, when painting this, explains that they use gold leaf specifically on the halos so that they glow, so that it shines. Jesus is radiant. He shines. And through his lived experience, presented God to normal people, living normal lives. And the effects of it were glorious. We see that through the stories in the Bible. We experience it through hearing and watching stories of transformation in our own community here. Jesus made the invisible God visible to us. Tangible, relatable even. And when we see what God is like, it creates a deeper, more personal relationship with him. Paul's desire at this point was to demonstrate that Jesus is more than just some kind, moral teacher, that he is divine. And as a result, we have access to a greater understanding of God, the creator and the sustainer of all things. So moving on to verse 19. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him. Let's take a look at this word fullness. God is and was proud and pleased to have his fullness, his divineness, be in Jesus, in his human form. God incarnate, which means God with us. God moving around Nazareth and Jerusalem, engaging with the sick and the broken, a supreme deity that was present. And this, to me, is the key essence in understanding the difference of Jesus' embodiment of supreme, as opposed to a removed dictator. See, not only is Jesus fully God, but he is also fully human. In the Christian faith, we have what are called creeds. And these are essentially statements of faith pulled together by the early church fathers so that there is a unity in understanding biblical truths, so that lost in translation over the course of history would not be a thing. And the Chalcedonian Creed is one of these creeds, and it lays out what it means for Jesus to be both truly God and truly human. And I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but it states in it that Jesus is to be acknowledged in two separate natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. Let me just read that again. Jesus is to be acknowledged in two natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, and inseparably. Meaning that Jesus is not half and half. That you don't slice him down the middle and one part of him is this glowing, glorious, heavenly, divine part, and then the other part is some kind of beige, mundane half. Nor does it work like those Venn diagrams where one circle says God, the other half says human, and it's the bit in the middle which Jesus taps into and works all the miracles from. You take both circles and you overlap them, and they become indistinguishable from each other, and yet consistently two different natures. Jesus presents us with a new way of being human. He dwelt with us, experienced pain. He was rejected by those closest to him. And still, he spoke of a real truth and of a continuous hope. Jesus, in his supremacy, was not removed. He was not an invasive rule maker, but an involved reformer, and a relentless optimist about you and about creation as a whole. So we move on to verse 20. And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. It's this word reconcile that I want to linger on. The act of the cross was not solely a demonstration of power, but a moment where the broken relationship between God and humanity was restored. The things that had separated us from him were no longer a barrier. It was about reconciliation. It was about the incredible lengths that Jesus went to in order to bring restoration, to bring healing. And in him humbly submitting himself to death, we were made free and invited into a closeness with God. This moment demonstrated his power and supremacy, but the motivation behind it was to bring connection between himself and those that were lost. He was displaying the power of God, but he was also bringing us back into step with him. So, why does Jesus' supremacy matter? Why does his radiating the nature of God, embodying the fullness of God, why does this reconciliation matter to people? Well, Paul is already one step ahead. He preempts this question. We can see that he has taken the first section of the reading and explained the person of Jesus. And then he pivots and he explains to the Colossians where they place in light of Jesus. And I very much mean in light of Jesus. That whole point, the whole point of going into depth about who Christ is, what he has done, is because only after understanding that do we understand how we relate to the full story, how we walk through each day. Everything that we do here at St. Mary's, everything that we're pushing into together to see transformation of the city, to be family to each other, to live fearless lives and to enjoy doing that is because of this. There's no point in doing this without grasping the bigness of God, the supremacy of Jesus. That's who informs our lives. That's who informs our prayers. That's who brings about change. The life that we live is not just about us. And N.T. Wright, he puts it this way when he says, Christianity isn't about a particular way of being religious. It isn't about a particular system of being saved. It isn't simply about a different way of holiness. Christianity is about Jesus Christ. It is from this place that we hold different expectations over situations. As I said, it informs how we pray. How we pray for Ukraine and Russia, that Jesus is supreme over those countries and over their leaders, that he will bring about justice. It informs the way that we pray for our loved ones who are ill, that Jesus is supreme over their bodies and minds. It informs how we carry hope into dark places, how we hope for change and renewal. I go into Winchester prison once a week as a volunteer chaplain, and that can be a pretty dark place at times. But I wouldn't be there if I didn't believe that Jesus is supreme over that place and over the people within it. Without that, I wouldn't believe that there was a hope or the promise of redemption there. And just before Christmas, I was asked to go and see this one guy. I hadn't met him before. He was essentially just a name on a list to me. So I went to his cell and I took him back to the chapel, and he was silent the whole way there until we sat down in the chapel, at which point he began to cry. And he couldn't make eye contact with me. He just kept repeating, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it anymore. He was the lowest that I have ever seen another human being. We talked a bit. We spoke about faith. I got him a Bible. We read through a few of the Psalms, and I finished by praying with him. And then over the course of the next few weeks, we continued to meet, and he continued to meet with other chaplains there too. 2 weeks ago, he got baptized. This last week, we chatted about what it is to be salt and light in that place. And he's already doing the stuff. He's already self-declared himself as a listener on that wing, that he is there to offer support and advice because he's experienced that for himself and he wants others to know it. Acknowledging that Jesus is supreme is acknowledging that he is not just Lord over your life, but Lord over the lives of others. That he is working in ways and places that we can't see or might not fully understand. That we trust that he moves and speaks today. That we trust him with the people that we care about or the situations that we don't understand. Paul wills the Colossians in verse 23 to continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. We do not back off, but we hold steady, confident in him. And so, when you are navigating a challenging time at work, or in a relationship, or with a family member, when you're celebrating yours or a loved one's achievement, Jesus is supreme over that. He is supreme over countries at war. He is supreme over viruses sweeping around the globe. When your anxieties are rising as you read another news story, he is Lord over that. He's the one who holds the galaxies together and holds you close. He has been present in the events of history and also desires to be present in the events of your life. He reigns over heaven and earth and also reigns over your heart and your desires. He is deeply personal. Personal to you and personal to creation. This is what supreme looks like. This is who Jesus is.